here and being part of our Sunday school class this morning. We're glad that you're here. We got a whole lot of things going on that we need to be aware of. Those that are sick. Betty White is at home. Adrian Edge, now he's supposed to be sick, but he's around all the time. So you see him coming all over the place. Terry Donaldson, this is a friend of Paul Blanzett, we need to remember. We also need to remember J.T. Beard. He's still in Guyana, I assume. And you hadn't let him come home yet? Coming home tomorrow. And also Greg and Sarah Pollock will be coming back tomorrow, so we need to remember them. Last night we lost our brother Jim Wilson, passed away about 7 o'clock last night, and we're sad about his passing, but we're glad about the fact that he was one of those folks that was a faithful Christian as long as he could go. You know, the old saying that you don't hear much anymore, but it applies to Jim. When they made Jim, they broke the mold. There was never another one like him. So he was some of those. One of my favorite things that I remember about Jim Wilson, I remember when I was trying to be a youth minister, and not doing very well at it. And I was in the office one day, and he came in, and I just kind of started unloading all of my problems on Jim and telling him about the kids that wouldn't do right and parents that wouldn't do right. And after a few minutes, he let me go on. And then he kind of cocked his head at me and pointed his finger at me, and he said, "Now, Tom, you just do what's right, and everything else will be okay." That's the way old Jim was. He just wanted to do right, and as long as he was doing right, he didn't worry about what other folks said about him. We've got a lot of things going on this week also. We need to remember John Roten. John's doing a little bit better. Jim Wilson's visitation will be here tomorrow at 11 o'clock. Funeral will be at 2 o'clock. There's a list in the foyer for those that would be willing to help with providing food. I think Brother Jim said they had about 75 family members for lunch tomorrow. If you can help with that, just please sign the list in the foyer, and that'll be taken care of. McKaylee Owens is leaving. I believe she's leaving on Tuesday of this week for basic training. So if you see her today, just wish her well. Another thing that we're going to do on the first Sunday night in November, we're going to have a soup and sandwich supper. It's a fundraiser for our scholarship fund in the annex. So if you can help by making a soup or sandwiches, or and it would definitely be a help if you can plan on being there and contributing a little bit to help out in our scholarship fund. It would be a great, great help. That's the first Sunday night in November. Today we're looking at Judges chapter 8. We've been talking about Judges for several weeks now, and today we're in Judges chapter 8. And Gideon has been the person we've talked about for the last two class meetings, and today we'll have our third and final lesson on the person Gideon. So we've covered a lot of ground with him, but today we want to learn a few things about Gideon. You know, in the world today, you have to be careful where you travel. I read an article several years ago about different places in the world that had landmines. And there were several countries that were listed: Angola, Afghanistan, and other places in the world, Cambodia. There were landmines still in the ground, and the problem was that most of the countries were poor. They couldn't afford to take them up, so they just left them there. So you always had to be careful where you go in those countries, because there were landmines. It's been said that we have to be as careful after the battle as we do before the victory. Sometimes there are still landmines out there that you could step into even after you've won a victory. And today, as we look at Gideon, we want to look at some of the landmines that Gideon was facing here in chapter 8. We'll look at some of the ways that Gideon had to deal with people that he came in contact with. And chapter 8 has several folks that we want to talk about. You know, when we first saw Gideon, he was full of questions. He was asking God, why me? He was full of doubt. And then when his faith grew, he believed in God's promises, and he went out and he won a great victory. And today we want to look at some of the responses that he had to people after he had won the victory. The first one is a soft answer for his critics. Let's look at Judges chapter 8, the first 3 verses. And the men of Ephraim said to him, "Why have you done this to us by not calling us when you went to fight the Midianites?" And they reprimanded him sharply. So he said to them, "What have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? God has delivered into your hands the princes of Midian, Orb and Zeb. And what is it that I was able to do in comparison with you?" Then their anger toward him was subsided when he said that. Notice here that in this paragraph that God gave a soft answer. He was talking to the Ephraimites. The tribe of Ephraim was one of the large tribes. It was one of the proud, important tribes of Israel. And they were reprimanding Gideon sharply because he didn't call them when he needed an army. He didn't even call them. You know, they were kind of mad. They were not happy. But when he did call them, they came out and they stopped the fords of Jordan, and they were able to capture two of the princes of Midian. They were able to capture and to kill Orb and Zeb, two of the princes of Midian. They had done a great thing when they were called out, but they were still not real happy with him. You know, they had come out when Ehud had called for volunteers. They were one that sent volunteers. When Deborah and Barak had called for volunteers, they had sent volunteers. But Gideon was a farmer, and he was a farmer from Manasseh. Gideon probably thought they wouldn't even come for him because he was not an important person. And yet they did come when he did call them after the battle had been over with. You know, it was probably wise of Gideon not to call the tribe of Ephraim. Can you imagine what these proud people would have said if they sent volunteers down and Gideon asked those that were afraid to just go home and their people left? What would they have said when Gideon reduced his army from 32,000 to 300, because a lot of them would have been sent home, most of them would have been sent home, they may not have been willing to come out again. You know, Gideon probably knew what he was doing, because he didn't call them in the beginning. But when he did call on them, they were ready and willing to help. You know, sometimes folks get mad at you over decisions that you make. They might want to fuss with you because of something that you've done or something you've said. But you know, I've noticed through the years that generally when people are mad at you, they want to complain to you, it's because there's a personal reason behind it. And I wonder if the reason behind them rebuking Gideon in the fact that they were not able to be part of the main receiving of spoils. You know, in those days, if you didn't participate in the battle, you didn't get to participate in the spoils. Now, David changed that a few generations later, where everybody in the army was able to participate in the spoils. But at this time, if you weren't there when the battle took place, you didn't get the spoils. And you wonder if this is not part of their problem, that they were wondering why they weren't called. There was over 100,000 men that were slain, that they didn't get to participate in very much of the spoils. This may have been part of the reasons that they were criticizing him. But as they were criticizing him, they were just adding to his burdens. They were making life harder for Gideon. You know, some have wondered, some commentators wonder why these three verses are here in the very beginning. They wonder if it shouldn't be at the very end, because, you know, they were all busy at this time. The Ephraimites were busy because they were guarding the fords of Jordan. Gideon was pursuing the kings of Midian. And some seem to think that maybe this should have been at the end, that as they were coming back, that they approached Gideon. But you know, here, after the victory, Gideon was an important person in Israel. He was a very important person. He had the power to say and do anything he wanted to with these people from Ephraim, because he was a national hero. But as you look at Gideon, he was able to hold his tongue. And I'm sure that Gideon didn't say the first thing that came to his mind. He was able to control his tongue. He was able to control his army. And Gideon gave them a soft answer. He actually was willing to say that they had done even more than he had done, because they had been able to capture these two princes of Midian, where he wasn't able to do it, but the Ephraimites were. And this seemed to have appeased the Ephraimites. You know, they stood together because of the soft answer that Gideon was able to give to the tribe of Ephraim. And they were able to stand together as brother tribes. They were able to be unified because Gideon was able to give a soft answer. I know in my life sometimes I need to be able to give a soft answer. Not to be so abrupt. not to criticize other people who are criticizing me. And it's hard to do sometimes. But Gideon was able to control his tongue. Let's look at something, another group of people that Gideon had to interact with. And on this group of people, he gave a stern warning to his skeptics. Let's begin in verse 4. When Gideon came to the Jordan, he and the 300 men who were with him crossed over, exhausted but still in pursuit. Then he said to the men of Succoth, "Please give us loaves of bread to the people who follow me, for they are exhausted, and I am pursuing Zebah and Zimwela, king of Midian." And the leaders of Succoth said, "Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in your hands, that we should give bread to your army?" So Gideon said, "For this cause, when the Lord has delivered Zebah and Zimwela into my hands, then I will tear your flesh with thorns of the wilderness and with briars." Then he came up from there to Peninnah and spoke to them in the same way, and the men of Peninnah answered him as the men of Succoth had answered. So he also spoke to the men of Peninnah, saying, "When I come back in peace, I will tear down this tower." Now Zebah and Zalmunna were at Kakor, and their armies with them, about 15,000, all who had left all of the army of the people of the east. For 120,000 men who drew the sword had fallen. Then Gideon went up by the road to those who dwelled in the tents of the east, and he attacked the army while the camp felt secure. And as you read on, it's verse 13. Then Gideon, the son of Joash, returned from battle, and he caught a young man of the men of Succoth and interrogated him, and he wrote down for him the leaders of Succoth and his elders, 77 men. Then he came to the men of Succoth and said, "Here is Zebah and Zalmunna, whom you ridicule me, saying, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in your hands, that he should give bread to your weary men?" And he took the elder of the city and the thorns of the wilderness and briars with them, and he taught the men of Succoth. Then he tore down the tower of Peninnah and killed the men of the city. Here we see a completely different reaction. When you look on your map, he was going into the tribe of Gad. On the east side of the Jordan, you had 2.5 tribes. You had Gad, Reuben, and half tribe of Manasseh. And he was going into the tribe of Gad. And as he was coming to these folks, he was asking for bread for his men. He wanted to make sure that his army was fed. And yet, these people at Succoth had decided that they weren't going to help him. They didn't send any volunteers to help Gideon. They hadn't sent any volunteers to help Ehud or Deborah. They were on the other side of the Jordan, and they weren't too concerned with what was happening on the west side of the Jordan. They didn't send volunteers, and yet they were still brothers. They were still part of Israel. But they didn't want to send anybody to help. You know, in this day, hospitality was an important thing. There was no place to go, no fast food places where you could pull in and feed your army. You had to depend on other people. You had to depend on the inhabitants of the land to help you. And here he was talking to brothers, people of the same, the children of Israel. And yet they were turning him down because they didn't think that he was going to be able to go and to defeat the Midianites. Their army had started out at 135,000, and now it was down to 15,000. And these folks didn't want to get involved. You know, they probably were concerned that if they gave bread to Gideon and he didn't defeat the Midianites, the Midianites would come back and destroy them because they had helped Gideon. But you know, these were your brothers. These were people that you should have been able to depend on. And yet they were not willing to help. They were not willing to do anything. And the first two cities he came to gave him the same answer. You know, isn't it providence that as Gideon was returning, that he just happened to find a person who knew who all of the 70-something leaders of the city were, and was able to give him that information. And then he knew who to talk to, who to see when he came back. And then it says that when he came to the city of Succoth, that he took the leaders out and he beat them. He didn't kill them, but he beat them. But when he went to the city of Penuel, he tore down the tower and killed the people that were in it. Gideon took revenge. The question here that you have to think about is, why would Gideon do this? Why would he be so harsh on these people when he gave a soft answer to the tribe of Ephraim? Couldn't he have just said, oh well, let's forget about it, the war's over? Probably the reason that he was so hard on these people as compared to the Ephraimites. Ephraim was lifted up in pride. Yes, it's a sin to be lifted up in pride. But the Ephraimites didn't do any damage to Gideon. They were just complaining. But when you look at the people of Gad, you'll see that they were not only refusing to help a brother, they were actually refusing to help God's people. Gideon represented the children of Israel in a way. He was there to deliver them from the Midianites. And these two cities in Gad were fighting against God because they weren't helping in God's people trying to rid themselves of the Midianites. Gideon had every right to do what he did because he was doing what God sent him to do. And the people of the two cities were rebelling against God. And he took the appropriate measures against them. A third group of folks that we want to look at today is found in Judges chapter 8, verses 18 through 21. Then he said to Zebah and Zalmunna, "What kind of men were they whom you killed at Tabor?" So he answered, So they answered, As you are, so were they. Each one resembled the son of a king. And he said to them, and then he said, They were my brothers, the son of my mothers. As the Lord lived, if you had let them live, I would not kill you. And he said to Jether, his firstborn, Rise, kill them. But the youth would not draw his sword, for he was afraid, because he was still a youth. So Zebah and Zalmunna said, Arise yourself and kill us as a man. So is his strength. So Gideon arose, and he killed Zebah and Zalmunna, and he took the crescent ornaments that were on their camels' necks. You know, here he had the two kings of Midian. They were criminals. They had done unspeakable acts to the children of Israel. 7 years prior to this, they came in and they took everything. And then we have a reference to a personal score that Gideon was trying to settle. You know, we don't have much record of what Gideon was talking about when he talked about his brothers that had been killed in Tabor. We don't know much about that. But we can speculate that it was probably during one of these seven years that the Midianites would come in, that some of his brothers had been killed. In those days, they didn't have a justice system like we have today. Each family was charged with the responsibility of taking vengeance for people that committed murder. The family was charged with the responsibility of hunting them down and seeking justice. You couldn't call the police because there weren't any. This was part of Gideon's responsibility as a family member. He was supposed to do this. He was supposed to hunt them down if they were guilty and take vengeance on them. And you know, there was no doubt that they were guilty, because for 7 years they had taken all of the food from the land. Can you imagine the amount of suffering that had gone on during those 7 years? Well, they took everything they had. Gideon was there to take vengeance for his family. This was part of his duties. Notice that they answered him in a flattering manner. He said they all looked like the son of a king. They were all people that you would associate with a kingly tribe. But you know, Gideon didn't fall for their flattery. He knew he had a responsibility to carry out. You know, in those days, it was important how a soldier died. In the next few chapters, we'll look at Abimelech. He didn't want to be known as a person that was killed by a woman. King Saul didn't want to be taken by the Philistines. And I'm sure that the two kings of Midian were horrified to think that here Gideon was turning over the responsibility of taking vengeance to a young man, calls him a child, the son of Gideon. But as the scriptures say, he was not able to do it. You know, if Gideon's son had have been the one to execute the kings of Midian, he would be forever known as the young man that killed the two kings of Midian. It was a responsibility that the family needed to take care of, but he didn't want to be the one to do it. And it seems like that the two kings of Midian, they wanted Gideon to do it anyway. It could be that they were concerned that maybe these two men, they may botch the job up and cause them a whole lot more pain, because they knew old Gideon was a good swordsman, that he could dispatch them very quickly. They kind of goaded him here, and he said, rise up. He said, rise yourself and kill us. As a man is, so is his strength. Gideon, you do it yourself. Show us what you're made of. And Gideon did. Gideon was able to kill the two kings. He took vengeance for his family. And it was the right thing for him to do in this situation. A fourth and final group that we want to look at today is a puzzling reply for his friends. Sometimes you have to scratch your head about Gideon. And as we read through these last verses, we need to wonder what he was thinking. The last part of the chapter, it focuses on two requests. One from the people to Gideon, and a request from Gideon to the people. Let's look at verse 22 and 23. It says, Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, Rule over us, both you and your son, and your grandson also. For you have delivered us from the hand of Midian. But Gideon said, I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. Gideon didn't want to be the king. He didn't want to be the person that was supposedly taking the place of God. Children of Israel knew that God sat on his throne in the tabernacle on the top of the Ark of the Covenant. That God hadn't authorized a king, and Gideon didn't want to be that king. He refused the gesture that they had made toward him. But let's look at verses 29 through 32. Then Jerubbaal, the son of Joash, went and he dwelled in his own house. Gideon had 70 sons who were his own offsprings, for he had many wives. And his concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, whose name he called Abimelech. Now Gideon, the son of Joash, died of the good old age and was buried in his tomb of Joash his father in Ophrah of the Abiezrite. Gideon didn't want to be the king, but as you notice in this reading, he lived like a king. He went home and he had many wives, 70 sons. You know, he had taken a good bit of things from the spoils of the war. Didn't want to be a king, but he wanted to live like a king. Kind of a puzzling situation. But Gideon lived like a king, but he didn't want to be the king. You know, this request from the people is probably an expression of unbelief in God. Moses had predicted that the children of Israel one day were going to want a king. And here they were wanting a king. They were wanting Gideon to be that king, but Gideon said, I'm not going to rule over you. God is going to rule over you. You know, it's commendable what Gideon said, but it's very puzzling the life he lived after the victories. He wanted to live like a king, but he didn't want to be a king. And then we have another puzzling part of Gideon's life. Verse 24, starting. Then Gideon said to them, I would like to make a request of you. For each of you would give me the earrings from their plunder, for they had golden earrings, because they were Ishmaelites. And so they answered, we will gladly give them. And they spread out the garment, and each man threw the earrings from his plunder. And the weight of gold earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, besides the crescent ornaments, pendants, and purple robes which were on the kings of Midian, and besides the chains that were around their camel's neck. And Gideon made it into an ephod, and he set it up in the city of Ophrah, and all Israel played the harlot with it there, because it became a snare to Gideon and to his house. Thus Midian was subdued before the children of Israel, so that they lifted up their heads no more, and the country was quiet for 40 years in the days of Gideon. Gideon said, I want you to give me your earrings. And they began to throw their earrings and their things onto a sheet. And it was over 40 pounds of gold. Gideon had enough to live on, to live an extravagant lifestyle, because of what the people were willing to give to him. And notice it says that he made an ephod. This was the priestly garment, the kind of garment that the high priest would wear. You know, we're really not sure exactly what kind of a garment it was, but he made something spectacular. And he set it up. The thing to remember is that Gideon wasn't a priest. He had no authority to make it. I'm sure he was doing something that he thought would help in the worship. He was making something he thought would keep people's mind on God. It makes me wonder today, when people want to change God's Word. You know, if we make this small change over here, it's going to make our worship better. If we make this change over here, it's going to make things even better, and we can remember God even better. But notice what he says here, that the people began to worship the garment that Gideon had made. It may be that he set it up like a standing idol, and the people turned away from God to worship an idol. You know, during this time, Gideon had a tremendous opportunity. He could have made a lot of changes over the children of Israel. There were still people that were worshiping Baal. And Gideon had the right instruments at the right time. Gideon could have made some tremendous changes, but he didn't. He set up something that became an idol to the people. And you'll notice after the death of Gideon that they went back to worshiping the Baals again. It was all for no avail, because they turned back to the idols after Gideon had left. The opportunity that Gideon had was squandered, because he was looking at how he could live his life in a comfortable way, how he could profit from the victories that he had won. You know what caused Gideon's spiritual decline? When I read through here, it seems like that Gideon was kind of like the Ephraimites. He was filled with pride. He looked back over his life and he could see the great things that he had accomplished. And somewhere down the line he had forgotten that it was God that had accomplished all of this and not simply him. Gideon did great things for his country. But at the end of his life, it showed a decline in him and his family. Next week we're going to look at what happened to his family after he left, after he was gone. You know, we started this morning talking about landmines, that you have to be careful of landmines. Gideon was a person that needed to have been careful. He needed to have been more watchful for the landmines that were still out there. And it applies to us today. There are still landmines that we need to be careful that we don't step on when we go about our business of worshiping and following after God. Our time is up for today. Next week we'll look at Abimelech and the Gideon's family. Thank you.